Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. If this is your first time joining a Kirkpatrick Price webinar, we are so glad that you are here. And if you've joined us in one of our months prior, welcome back. My name is Lindsay Colbert, and I'm the Director of Marketing and your moderator for today's session. Today's going to be really insightful as we learn about the most impactful changes in PCI version 4. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. As a reminder, all attendees will be in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions, please add those to the questions box, and we will leave time at the end to be able to address those. Also, if you would like CPE credit for attending today, just send us an email to hello@kirkpatrickprice.com and we will send that over to you. And final reminder, everyone will receive a copy of the recording in your inbox tomorrow. So if you want a copy of the slides, you will get that. Now, at Kirkpatrick Price, we know when it comes to threats, you want to make sure that you're ready. And in order to do that, you need quality cybersecurity and compliance audit reports with results you can trust. The problem is that audits are hard because the process is complicated and it feels overwhelming. But we believe if you're going to do it, the audit should be worth it. We've been in your shoes and we know how hard audits can be. But we've issued at over 10,000 reports here at Kirkpatrick Price to over 1,200 clients worldwide, giving them the assurance they deserve. We would like to connect with you, so we encourage you to follow us on social media, sign up for our monthly newsletter, the readiness report. All of that can be done on our website, kirkpatrickprice.com. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Randy Bartels' experience crosses a wide range of information technology and disciplines, including security and network architecture, software lifecycle management, operations, and penetration testing. As Vice President of Security Services at Kirkpatrick Price, Randy is responsible for leading complex engagements and investigating risk in new areas of technology. He holds CISSP, CSLIP, CISA, QSA, and CCSK certifications. Randy is passionate about bringing awareness to clients about the day-to-day activities that they can use to ensure that they are meeting their security and compliance objectives. Welcome to the webinar, Randy.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Appreciate it. And so let's jump right in. We've got an action-packed hour together, and so we're just going to get right to it. On this afternoon's webinar, we're going to cover really the things that you see here, right? So first, we're going to give you a brief overview of the DSS version 4, and then we're going to cover some of the changes that are due with your very first V4 assessment. And then finally, we're going to cover the things that are going, all the net new requirements that will be due about a year later after that, right, in 2025. So, like I said, more than enough to talk about this hour. So we're going to give it our very best, right? So, just a quick overview on version 4. First, we say PCI and we mean DSS, right? The data security standard is one of about 15 different requirements that are maintained by the PCI Security Standards Council, PCISecurityStandards.org for their website. And most of it's the one that applies to like just about everybody, right? If you're developing software that are going to release into the market, then the Software Security Foundation might apply to you. Or if you're, producing the cards that go out to consumers and you're actually cutting the plastic, then there's a card production security standard that applies. But the data security standard is the one that applies to all merchants and the service providers that support them. And that's the one that we're talking about today. So when they first put this together, and it's been a process, Kirkpatrick Price, we engaged in both of the requests for comments that came out, and it's been going on for a number of years that they've been working on version 4. They really set out to accomplish 4 different priorities, and we can see them here. I'm not going to read every slide, thank goodness. But I did want to specifically call out that third one around flexibility. right? So on the next slide, we're going to introduce the customized approach so that we can understand, like just enough, just so that we know how to navigate it, right? But we're not going to go into it in great detail. Instead, if you want to learn more about the data security standard, version 4 of the standard, you can head over to the Council's version 4 DSS resource hub, PCISecurityStandards.org, and go to the resource hub from there. It should be pretty easy to find. Likewise, on our page, we have a number of resources around the data security standard as well at kirkpatrickprice.com. So let's jump into this defined approach versus the customized approach, right? So the defined approach is exactly the way we've been doing PCI since version 1 of the standard, right? And probably even since then. It was actually being managed by Visa in the early 2000s, right? And that it is, here are the 6 things that you must do in order to be compliant with this requirement. And here's the way that we want you to do it. Figure out how that applies to your tech stack, and it's the way we've always done PCI. And you can see that here with requirement 6.3.3, what is now 6.3, used to be 6.2 in the old standard, right? In version 3. Get your patches on within 30 days for any criticals and highs. Everything else can be done in a reasonable time frame thereafter. And so that is the defined approach. We also now have an option for almost all of the controls, almost all of the requirements in version 4 for a customized approach. Just know, like, we don't expect a lot of our customers to use this, right? First, it's a lot more work. It's a lot more work on your part. It's a lot more work on your QSA's part, right? And now we will have a few customers that use it. They're going to generally be very risk mature organizations, and it's going to be in the cases where the defined approach is not really working for them, right? And so we may end up with a customized approach in those cases. We don't expect a lot of our customers to use it, but it is there. It is an option, and we're just going to call it out enough today. So that we can contrast it against what we've always had in the defined approach. If you do go down that road, just make sure to go refer to Appendix D and E, Delta and Echo, in the Data Security Standard publication available from the Council. Okay, so now let's summarize some of these changes, right? So up on the PCI Security Standard Council, PCISecurityStandards.org website, if you go to their document library, you'll see 2 documents right at the very top, right? Version 4 of the DSS, and then the summary of changes document. We're going to be referring to both of those in this afternoon's in this webinar this afternoon. But really, it's the summary of changes. Now, when you crack open that summary of changes document, you are going to see every comma, every period, every dot, every tilde, every word change, everything is going to be listed in that summary of changes document. And then also, it's going to list the 64 net new requirements that have been defined in version 4 of the standard, right? So 53 of those changes apply to everybody, right? Whether you're a merchant or a service provider, they apply to everybody. And then the last 11 apply only if you are a service provider, right? So now, before we go into all of those changes, let's spend just a minute on a couple of dates that we just need to make sure that we fully understand these dates and how they apply to your transition, right? So the first date is March the 31st, 2024, 1 year from tomorrow. The Data Security Standard version 3 will be retired. And that means any assessment that is completed after 1 year from tomorrow, March the 31st, 2024, any assessment that is completed after that date will need to be done to version 4, completed after that date. So therefore, we recommend that any assessment that starts after January the 1st, 9 months from tomorrow, right, that we start that assessment on version 4, because we just don't know what's going to happen. Will there be any surprise remediation that comes up in your assessment that's going to delay the completion? Will there be, somebody got sick, or, some family emergency that put things on hold? We just don't know what's going to happen. And so therefore, that will give us plenty of time to complete that assessment and not get into a crunch and suddenly have to flip versions, right? And so anything happening starting after next January, it's going to be our recommendation that we complete that against version 4. Okay, so then a year from that, 2 years from tomorrow, right, the other 51 requirements are going to come due. Now, I do want to make, and I'm going to make this point a few times this afternoon, right, because this is an important one, right? March the 31st, 2025 is the due date for all of those additional requirements. Every QSA who will be doing version 4 assessments goes through transition training. I've done it. Most of the people on Kirkpatrick Price team have finished the version 4 transition training for QSAs. And in that training, the council has said, QSAs, doesn't matter whether the assessment is done in June, in July, or in December, you'll have to test and make sure that the net new requirements were in place as of the due date. In other words, we got to look back in time. So if you miss some of those and they are important and applicable to your situation, your only recourse is you have a functional DeLorean in the garage and you can go back in time and fix that, right? That's about it, because otherwise, if it's applicable and it wasn't in place by March the 31st, 2025, council's pretty clear that, time-based requirements like that, we end up in a non-compliant situation. Right, we do our very best that we can to try to work through that, but the end result is usually that it's going to be not compliant. All right, so we want to avoid that at all costs, right? So just make sure you're managing to that March 31st, even if your own assessment is weeks, months, or quarters later, right? March the 31st, 2025, to get all of the net new requirements in place as they apply to your environment. Okay. And again, I'm going to repeat that probably 3 or 4 more times this afternoon, right? Okay, so let's talk about the 13 requirements that are due with your first V4 assessment, the one that we recommend for anything starting after January of next year, that we do this on V4, right? So there are 10 of them take on this very form that you see right here. Roles and responsibilities for performing activities in requirement, fill in the number, are documented, assigned, and understood. Now, and so again, that is repeated requirements 2 through 11, right? So let's pull this apart. And just in case you're not, this is your first exposure to PCI data security standard, right? If that's you, the way that a QSA pulls this apart is we take each of the nouns and repeat each of the verbs with them, right? So the nouns are roles and responsibilities. The verbs are documented, assigned, and understood. So are roles documented? Well, that might be in a policy, right? Are roles assigned? That might also be in a policy, could be in a RACI table, could be in a job description, could be in a number of different things. But so far, we've got 2 documentations that we're going to be looking at, right? 2 pieces of documentation. Are roles assigned? Are roles documented? Are roles assigned? And then finally, are roles understood? And that sounds like it's a conversation with the person to whom they are assigned, right? So that's 2 pieces of documentation and an interview. And then we repeat for responsibilities, right? And so as long as we find that is the case, roles and responsibilities are both documented, assigned, and understood, then we end up with a compliant status on this particular item. Right. Now, this is a documentation review. It's not real. We're not really trying to get over Mount Everest on this one, right? But it does need to be something formal that we're looking at for this. And this again is due with the first assessment moving to version 4. And again, it covers 10 of them, right? So now we only got 3 more to go through, right? So let's take a look at the next one. This one is, we've found a few organizations that are already doing this in a formal capacity, right? But requirement 12.5.2 says once a year, we need to go pull apart our scope and make sure that the scope includes all the places where cardholder data is transmitted, processed, or stored, and that we also include, our network diagrams and our data flow diagrams are up to date, and our list of vendors is accurate, and all the things. There's I think there's 7 different things that are on this particular requirement, and the QSA will be pulling apart each of those 7 things as we go through requirement 12.5.2. Scope is so important that for the 18 years that I've been doing PCI, it has always been my mantra that we start talking about scope on day 1, and if we ever stop talking about scope, it's the last thing we ever talk about, right? So scope is that important, right? Many of the super mega breaches that we had, especially in the early days, were because of scoping problems, right? Even the Target breach was because of a scoping problem, right? And that's the one that everybody seems to remember because many of us have shopped at Target, right? So I will also point out that this particular requirement, 12.5.2, is important for it's a twice annual. It's a every 6 months thing for if you're a service provider. Right now, let me just point out, like every 6 months, it's a twice a year thing. That's not 7 months and 5 months. That's not 8 months and 4 months, right? No more than 6. And the council actually in version 4 of the data security standard, they actually define what they mean by quarterly, because we were getting that much ambiguity, or that much, just weirdness around. What do you mean by quarterly? And same thing for semi-annual. They've actually gone to the point where they defined what these things mean, right? So every 6 months, that's not 7 and 5, that's not 8 and 4, that's not more than 6. It can be 6 and 4 and 4 and 6, but it can't be more than 6 months apart between these scoping validations, right? Okay, then there is finally another one, and as we've already said, we've introduced the customized approach just enough so that we could hang something on it, right? But if you end up going down the customized approach route for one or more of your controls, for each requirement that is going to be met by the customized approach, there needs to be a specific customized approach targeted risk assessment, and this is all documented in Appendix D and E of the data security standard. Again, a lot of additional work that needs to be done, but if that ends up being helpful to you, you probably end up going down that road. Do make sure that you engage your QSA for that, especially if you're doing this for the very first time. There is a lot of I dotting and T crossing that needs to happen going down the customized approach route with this targeted risk assessment. Your QSA cannot both assess your customized approach implementation and help you design it. That is called out very specifically again in this transition training that we've all had to go through. The same QSA, the same organization, cannot both design your customized approach with you and assess that customized approach. So they're enforcing some strict segregation of duties between those who design and implement and those who assess the customized approach. Okay, so again, refer to Appendix D and E for this additional information on how to do the customized approach, and then definitely engage with your QSA. Let me just see if there is. I meant to move my mouse on the other screen. Sorry about that. Okay, so then there is one more in requirement 12, maintain an information security policy, and this one is for service providers only. And so as a service provider, your customers are counting on you for specific information, specifically for their ability to comply with 12.8.4 and 12.8.5. Now, there have been some service providers in the market who have said, I'm not required to give you this information, and so I don't know how you're going to do it, but go away, right? And that's unfortunate, because it would leave their customers hanging, right? So now it is a requirement in 12.9.2 under the vendor, the requirements to 12.9 applies to service providers only. So 12.9.2, that service providers need to provide the information that their customers need in order to comply with 12.8.4 and 12.8.5. 12.8.4 is as the entity who's being assessed, you need to maintain a program to monitor your vendor's compliance, your service provider's compliance, right? Now, that might just be that the service provider provides an attestation of compliance. If so, move on. we're done, right? Because that's everything that the QSA and this and the and the covered entity, right, need in order to determine your compliance. Done. We're all set, right? Now for 1285 is that every entity needs to maintain information about which controls are implemented by themselves and which ones they count on their vendors, their service providers, to do on their behalf. So that usually looks like a list of data security standard requirements going 1.1.1 and all the way down to 12.11. Whatever, right? Going down the left-hand side, and then columns. We do it, our service provider does it, or we share it. And that's usually so that's a shared responsibility matrix. And so the council is saying, yeah, you should probably provide a shared responsibility matrix to your customers so that they know which controls that they can count on you for. And usually it's so that the QSA can determine, no, the service provider is not in fact doing that for you. They said that you're responsible for that. And because we end up in that situation where, oh, it's in the cloud, so it must be secure. The cloud provider's doing it, and the cloud provider says, no, we're not, right? And so that's that shared responsibility matrix to help inform the customer. These things are our responsibility, these things are yours, and these are the things that we're sharing. So that's 12.9.2. And that covers all 13 of the requirements that are due with your first version 4 assessment. Okay, so now let's shift gears and look another year ahead into the future, right? So, now this is a summarized, grouped list of some of the changes that apply. I think I got them all in this list, right? In other words, everything that all 51 items that are due in 2025, I think they fit into all of these categories, right? We're not going to talk about all of them. Thank goodness I don't have enough coffee to do that. And so we're going to talk about the first 5 or 6 probably, right? And so, but you can see as you go through this list, all of the requirements, really requirement 1 through requirement 12, are represented in this list, right? So the changes in the data security standard, all the net new items, they run the gamut really of the entirety of the data security standard itself. All right, so let's jump into a couple of these, right? So first, let's talk about some protections that are expected around stored cardholder data. Cardholder data that gets written to some piece of media, right? So the first one is that if you are using hashing in any capacity, right? So for instance, we sometimes will see that organizations are hashing cardholder data and as their primary mechanism to comply with historically what's been requirement 3.4. How do you store cardholder data such that it's secure, right? And hashing is one of those options. But we also see that people use hashing of cardholder data in their application logs. They don't need to know what the cardholder data is, but if they ever needed to, they might be able to use the hash to compare, hey, was it this one? And then they can hash it and they see that, oh, yes, it is this one. Okay. But and so sometimes we'd see that in our application logs. So that's just a couple of cases where we might see hashing of cardholder data. So what the new requirement is that starting again March the 31st, 2025, that all hashed cardholder data needs to be hashed using a cryptographic, a keyed-based hashing mechanism, right? So we're going to take an encryption key that is managed according to all of the PCI key management requirements, right? And then we're going to use that as an input to our SHA hashing algorithm. And now it's going to be a keyed hashing algorithm. And then that way, if we end up, that key gets compromised, we can generate a new key, right? Or if we've generated too much data, we've reached the crypto period, right? Through either legitimate use or because of a key compromise, we can replace the key and we can keep on going, right? But many hashing algorithms today are not keyed in how they are implemented. So, so that is a new standard, that is a new requirement, applies anywhere where you're doing hashing of cardholder data. This one is potentially a very big impact, at least in a number of the customers that we've worked with here at Kirkpatrick Price, right? So disk encryption, this is your BitLockers. This is your encrypted EBS volume on an AWS EC2 instance or whatever, database and whatever, all the things, right? Disk encryption can no longer be the primary control for encrypting of cardholder data in storage. That means it will now need to be file-based encryption, column-based encryption, some other mechanism specified in what is now requirement 3.5. In a number of cases, whatever, if it was requirement 3.4, where we talked about different ways to, it's now 3.5. If it was 6.2, it's now 6.3. A lot of the requirements have just moved down, right? Not all of them, but many of them have. So, you'll have to choose another method from 3.5.1 or implement column. Maybe your application will do it, or maybe you'll implement transparent data encryption on your SQL server and then put in a VOR metric to manage the keys, right? Or something like that, right? Some sort of a crypto system to manage all of that, right? So those will continue to be fine if that's your current implementation. But it's those cases where we're counting on BitLocker, we're counting on Google, we're counting on Amazon, and they just do it and it's automagical. That is especially EBS volumes and so on, and encrypted cloud storage and things like that, right? Those are the kinds of situations that are being called out. The only exception where encryption, disk encryption continues to be reasonable, continues to be valid as the control, is if you are putting cardholder data on removable media. For instance, if you're putting cardholder data on a thumb drive. I don't know anybody who does that, but it's actually listed in there as an example in the standard for this one, right? So putting cardholder data on removable media, disk encryption is still your friend, but in all other cases, you'll need something else. Now we have two years to figure this out from today, right? Okay. Let's talk about retention of sensitive authentication data. Keep in mind, sensitive authentication data, it's the track data from actually swiping the card, or the track equivalent data for the chip, right? It is the CVV code on the back of your Visa or MasterCard, right? It's on the front of your Amex, but and it's the PIN block data. Those are the three instances of sensitive authentication data. And sensitive authentication data, it has never been and continues to not be okay to store sensitive authentication data after authorization. For context, before you leave the grocery store aisle, that transaction has already been authorized, right? In almost every case, unless like the network is down at the grocery store, right? That's about the only case when you don't have authorization before you left the cashier's the cashier's lane, right? In every other case, whenever there is a separation between the event of capturing your cardholder data, that my credit card number is, and authorizing it. So for instance, you make a reservation for a hotel. You're going to be there in 2 weeks. That's storing sensitive, almost many cases, that's storing sensitive authentication data prior to authorization. And so that's one of the common use cases. Same thing for rental cars and really anything that involves a reservation, right? And so it's never been okay to retain sensitive authentication data after authorization. But the standard has been like mum on what to do about it if you have to retain it before authorization, between capture and authorization, hotel reservations, for instance, right? So what we now have is that we have a couple of new requirements that apply to retaining sensitive authentication data before authorization. So our data retention policies need to call that out specifically, right? Even if it's to the point where you say, yeah, and we don't. Okay, then your data retention policy should say we do not retain sensitive authentication data for any purpose whatsoever. But if you do have that situation where you do need to, then you'll need to call that out, and we can retain it for up to, and put a date, right, or a number of days, or 180 days. Maybe that's the maximum reservation time frame that as a hotel, maybe that's all you'll do, right? Okay, so and then that sensitive authentication data needs to be encrypted, stored, preserved, all the other things about it, just the way that you would also do for cardholder data, right? So we have to encrypt it with strong crypto. right? And again, this is any time that sensitive authentication data ends up on a piece of media. If it got written, even if it's just for a couple of minutes. I was just working with a customer a couple of months ago, and they write the sensitive authentication data to a table in Microsoft SQL Server that lasts 5 minutes. And there's even a garbage collection routine that comes along and cleans that up. But that is still retained sensitive authentication data, and it needs to be encrypted. It needs to be data retention policies. In the case, it should say 5 minutes. Right? Yeah, okay, so you get the idea. Sensitive authentication data is now being called out as a specific set of requirements that apply in the case that you need to hold on to that for any period of time whatsoever. All right, we are kind of jumping around. We're trying to get the most impactful requirements, right? So the next one we're going to talk about is for vulnerability management, right? So we have always had to do vulnerability scans, and they have been network-based or anonymous, not signing in. We just query an IP address. Are you listening on this port? If so, what things are you vulnerable to, right? And that's just been our, Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, whatever the tools are that we're using to do that. And that's always been the case. Starting in 2025, those vulnerability scanners will now need to log into the system. It now needs to be an authenticated vulnerability scan, performed from a perspective of privilege, right? The user account that you're using to sign in needs to have access to the things, which probably means root on Linux, and it probably means a local administrator on a Windows machine, right? And so the vulnerability scanner now needs to log in and now be an authenticated vulnerability scan. Now, if you have never done a authenticated vulnerability scan, you'll be in for a surprise. It is a much more thorough, hopefully fewer false positives, because we're actually reading the DLL. We're actually reading the Linux library. We're actually reading the Linux package database, which applications are installed on this Windows machine. And that's what an authenticated vulnerability scan, what configuration settings apply, reading the registry, reading the etc directory on a Linux machine, right? Much more thorough. That also can result in a lot more findings, because now it's not just whether or not your FTP server or your HTTP server is up to date, but is everything up to date? Even the local privilege, the local based exploits and whatnot, those are going to come out, right? The same requirement applies as far as like what does a passing scan mean, right? So you still need to make sure that your passing scans do not have any, high or critical vulnerabilities. If so, you need to rescan and make sure, clean them up and rescan again, make sure they're all gone, right? So that all still applies. So I would recommend that you start doing your authenticated vulnerability scans well in advance of March the 31st, 2025. For sure, at least 1 or maybe even 2 quarters in advance, right? More if you can afford it, right? That way you can continue to use your unauthenticated, still fine as a vulnerability scan results, and still continue to meet the requirement while you're ramping up what it means to manage all the things that come out of an authenticated vulnerability scan. So do that one early, right? And you run them in parallel, because when we wake up on April the 1st, 2025, it's authenticated from that point forward, and we still have to meet all the other requirements about being clean and all the other clean scans, no high risk, no criticals, and all that, clean, redo it, all those other things still apply. Do that one early. Let me also just point out, we're getting a lot of I've seen a lot of instances of agent-based vulnerability scanning. This is the Qualys agent, the Rapid7 agent, so on and so all the different software vulnerability scanning vendors have their own agent now, right? So like think about that like in the context of a remote workforce. We need to get vulnerability scans done of our call center agents, and they've been working from home since sometime early 2020. And so how do we do that? Well, we're going to put the agent on it. The agent's going to scan locally and report the results back to the console. And also the same thing goes in our AWS, our EC2 instances. We've been seeing a lot of use of that in there because, maybe it's a longer lived EC2 instance, but we don't have great inbound connectivity from a vulnerability scanner to get to it. So we're going to put the agent on it and let it report the results back. In those cases where I've seen those tools, specifically, I think the two that I've personally seen have been Rapid7 and Qualys. In both of those cases, they are running from that perspective of a privileged user. The agent is running as administrator or local security account (LSA) on a Windows machine or as root on a Linux machine. In which case, that's going to satisfy your authenticated vulnerability scan. Right. So I did want to call that. It's not a pitch to go out and buy the agent based, right? And certainly not of those specific vendors. But just know that is one of the ways in which we've been seeing a lot of people already doing this, even though authenticated vulnerability scans are not necessary. They've already been doing that even for the last year or two with the agent being installed on their endpoints. Okay. One more thing around vulnerability management. There is also now I believe it's under requirement 12, where we now also need to review annually all of our hardware and software that is within scope, that which transmits, processes, stores cardholder data, or that which can impact the security of or is connected to. We have to take a look at all of this stuff once a year and see if there have been any support notices. Like, hey, this is going to be end of life in the next 18 months, kind of, announcements like that, right? Is it still supported by the vendor? Have there been any major end of life announcements and things like support announcements that have come out about the versions that we're running? And if so, then we need a documented and approved plan to remediate, to get off of those. Now, and so that is a net new requirement, again, with a March 31st, 2025 sunrise. So that means your first review of that needs to be done by March 31st, 2025. And if you have anything unsupported, then you have to develop those remediation plans in that same time frame as well. Okay, moving right along, application security. Okay, so we have always had two ways, well, at least since version 3. I can't remember when this one particularly came out, but I know it's at least been since version 3 came out. 2016, I think, is when that, right? At least since then. But we've always had two ways to secure our internet-facing credit card affected applications. We could either do an application vulnerability scan using personnel who are knowledgeable in such things and who are independent from the actual coding, right? Or we could use a web application firewall. Well, what the council is saying now in this, historically it's been a requirement 6.6. I can't remember if that number changed. I'm going to have to learn all new numbers again. For those of us who have been around PCI a while, we're used to throwing out book, chapter, and verse reference numbers, and we all know what we're talking about. We're going to have to learn all new numbers again. But to meet that, historically, we've had these two ways. And what the council is saying is only a web application firewall is going to be good starting in 2025. So now we do have a number of customers who are doing static analysis, security testing. Maybe as part of their dev pipeline, they're bringing in SonarQube or GitHub Actions or CodeQL, something like that, right, to do that. And that's a very good practice. The council is saying you must also have a WAF. Most of our customers, maybe all of them, but at least most of our customers who are doing static analysis security testing have also implemented a WAF. They're already doing the both, right? So you're going to be just fine. But if you do not yet have a web application firewall in place in front of your credit card enabled applications, then you will need to put a WAF in place, even if you're already doing static analysis. Okay. The next one around application security is that all of our payment pages will need to have change and tamper detection mechanisms in place, right? Now, gone are the days when it was payment.html or even payment.aspx, right? Where we're generating a static page, right? Maybe a few CSS elements and some images or whatever to, make it dynamic, but gone are those days, right? That doesn't really happen nearly as often as what is now happening, right? Where we end up with a JavaScript that renders the payment page dynamically inside the browser, right? But this change detection and change and tamper detection mechanism needs to be in place to cover all the ways in which a payment page could be rendered, including dynamically or statically, right? And now this one, to me, this one is like, let's first figure out what we're actually talking about, because this feels like something like not even a lot of products out there in the marketplace, right? I could be wrong about that, but it just kind of feels like that, right? The council does provide, here, let me actually just put this up here, right? The council provides one of the more lengthy guidance columns around this particular one, just to kind of give some ideas, right? Hey, what are we really talking about here? Right. And so, but you know, the end result of this is, it is not that we put some sort of anti-X solution in the browser on the consumer's browser. That's not what this is not meant to make the browser do this, right? One, we can't count on the browser because we have to assume that the browser is part of the threat profile, the consumer's browser, right? And so, but you know, so they give a number of different ways: content security policies, some sort of external monitoring system. Maybe there's some hidden tokens. I'm not sure what this actually looks like. So this one's going to need a little bit of time especially from the software engineering guys, maybe to figure out what this looks like and how you might perform this from your endpoint perspective, right? From your server perspective as it receives the data. And maybe also some sort of change detection on that JavaScript page before it goes out, right? So call this one out. I think this is a requirement 11.6. Going to need a little bit of time to figure out what we can do in each application's case, and then to actually put it into place. All right. The council, the data security standard also calls out some anti-phishing controls, anti-phishing as social engineering. And so we're going to see both technical and administrative, security awareness training for anti-phishing. The technical controls are going to be under requirement 5. Where we need to have, whether we're doing our email through through a cloud provider or whether we're hosting our Exchange system in-house, we need to have some anti-phishing technical controls in place. And then we also need to have security awareness training that speaks to both anti-phishing and anti-social engineering mechanisms. And so again, if you're already in like Office 365 or Google G Suite, you probably already have this in place. But especially if you're running your own email system, we just need to make sure that we've got all the pieces in place. The target of this particular set of controls is anybody who has access to system components where the cardholder data is being transmitted, processed, or stored. Right, so your DevOps engineers, your system engineers, your network people, so on and so forth. We're really trying to protect those people against anti-phishing attacks that could be by which the bad guy would then get the credential and be able to log in and change things. Multi-factor authentication is also called out with some changes here as well. So we've always had to implement multi-factor authentication for all non-console system administration access. If the keyboard you're typing on is not plugged into the back of the thing that you're issuing the commands to, then you are a non-console administrator. MFA is required in that case. And we've always needed it as well for our SSL remote access VPNs. SSL VPN, maybe some people are still doing some IPsec remote access, right? So we've always needed multi-factor authentication for those things. And what it comes up now in 2025 is that we also need multi-factor authentication for all access, whether it's remote or not, right, to the cardholder data environment. So now this does not apply to people who have access to just one credit card number at a time, right? There is also, and this is actually called out specifically in the data security standard, there is also the potential that they might have to MFA more than once, right? So for instance, if you're doing MFA multi-factor authentication on your remote access SSL VPN, and that SSL VPN grants access to all kinds of corporate resources, one of which might be your cardholder data environment, then you would need to MFA a second time. Once to get onto the SSL VPN, once before you got into the cardholder data environment. And then also still the requirement applies for MFA on all non-console administration access. So some changes there with MFA. And then really to wrap things up, we're just going to spend a minute talking about there are a number of controls in the data security standard that say, go out and figure out how often you need to do this, right? So how often should you scan the entire hard drive for viruses? That is now, instead of, I think before it was once a week, I think it was, but now it says go out and figure out how often you should do that. How often should your passwords expire? Yeah, we don't have to expire our passwords necessarily every 90 days now. Go out and figure out how often it should be. So there's a number of these different requirements that allow you to specify how frequent, and in those cases, there is now a requirement that says, and this is a requirement 12.3.1, and it says conduct a targeted risk assessment for anything that allows you to specify the frequency. And what this now called a TRA, right? And this TRA is your justification as to why it is quarterly, not weekly, or why it is annually, not quarterly, so on and so forth, right? And so this is your opportunity to defend those decisions. I will also say, starting in 2025, what was the enterprise-wide risk assessment requirement goes away, and it gets replaced by this TRA, right? So while you'll still, if you're doing SOC 2 or ISO or any of the other ones, you'll still have to do an enterprise risk assessment. PCI says what we really want you to do is make sure that you've got a good understanding of the risks that apply to cardholder data in your environment. So they're doing away with the enterprise, replacing this with this targeted risk assessment, right? And so there, we're gonna walk through one of these here. Just going to take us a couple of minutes to do this. So this is requirement 12.3.1, and you see it's got 6 different things, and we're gonna touch on the first 4. The last 2 are really just housekeeping, right? And so we have to identify the assets that are being protected. These are your nouns, right? The things that in your environment are going to be protected, right? And then identify what are the threats that the requirement is actually designed to protect against. And then what are the factors that contribute to whether or not the threat could be realized. And then this one right here, this 4th one, is really this is where the hard work is, if you're asking me, right? Because we now need to document the analysis that, hey, we came up with semi-annual, and this is why, right? And so we're looking now for that analysis to justify the frequency that you've come up with. And then, like I said, the last 2 are really just housekeeping. Let's walk through a quick scenario on this, right? So we've got a company, Acme Corp. How more generic could you get? Right? I'm sorry if you actually work for Acme Corp. To me, I always think of Acme Corp as like from the Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons, that if you're over probably 45 years of age, you probably woke up every Saturday morning to watch those, right? That's what I'm thinking of when I think of Acme Corp. So Acme Corp has an application called Cardbase, and this is used by accounting personnel and also by call center personnel. And so as employees, people get promoted, or they move into and out of, or hired and terminated, all the things that happen in these 2 departments. And that access already needs to, under requirement 7.2.4, also a net new requirement, needs to be reviewed every 6 months. But there are also service accounts that are used by the application, by the back end. There's an application, there's a database user account that the application signs into MariaDB with, and because that's where the database is at, right? And then there's an SFTP user that's used by different automation or batch processing tasks, right, to move data onto and off of the system, right? And the new requirement 7.2.5.1, I think is what it is. It's kind of scary that I'm already getting these locked away in memory. But the new requirement is, that you get to define how often you're going to review the security of those TRAs. And as long as you can justify it, anything other than we will not review them, anything else besides that is going to be good, as long as the TRA can back it up, right? So I'm thinking like each of those 6 bullet points under 12.3.1 gets called out on a form somewhere. This feels pretty straightforward to me, right? It's just a process built around a form and 6 pieces of information. So assets being protected, it's the MariaDB user account. It's the SFTP automation account. Notice how we're using actual nouns so that we know exactly which nouns we're talking about, right? And then what is 7.2.5.1 actually calling out? What is it designed to protect against? Well, it's designed to protect against accounts having too much permissions based on just, based on having been, incrementally added to over time to account for new features in the application. What are some of those factors? Well, the application is under active development. It gets a new release every month. And so those changes could become additive, especially if there was something taken away in one of the application changes, and we didn't reflect that in the permissions that were needed by the MariaDB user account, for instance. So then we get into the analysis, and this is where you're going to explain why. And in this case, we said a year is fine, because even though the application is under active development, those have all almost exclusively been additive changes, is kind of what this analysis came out to be, right? And so a year seems fine. We'll check it again in a year and make sure it's still fine. And that's really what we're saying down here in this last one. We checked it. A year is still okay. And we're going to check it again the next time it comes up, and make sure that we don't need to do it more frequently. So that's a targeted risk assessment for a control where you get to define. Remember, there are 2 TRAs, one for customized approach and one for the control that you get to assign for the frequency. All right, let's recap. 2 critical dates: March the 31st, 2024. By then, every assessment that completes after that date, it will be on a V4 report on compliance. And March the 31st, 2025, and that's for getting all of the other net new requirements in place. And keep in mind, your assessor has to go back in time, no matter what time your assessment is done after that, and make sure that those 51 net new requirements were in place by that date. We covered a bunch of different things in today's webinar. You can see them listed there. Just know we couldn't get to all of them, but these are the ones that we felt were probably the most impacting across the board, right? Others may impact you even a little bit more in some cases, right? So, all right. So, I hope this was helpful for you. Looks like we had quite a few people come in and join us today, and thank you to each one of you. Let me open it up for some questions, and for that, I'm going to ask Lindsay to help us out and see what questions you guys have thought of over the course of the webinar. Do our best to answer them.
We've got several, Randy. The first is, how is customized different from a compensating control?
You bet. That's a great question. So a customized approach, you don't even need a compensating control. Compensating control is only valid for the defined approach. And so you can still have a defined approach, what is now called the defined approach. You can still have that and go down a compensating control. There was a period of time where we thought that the customized approach would completely obviate the need for a compensating control, but that is no longer the case. That has been clarified by the council. You defined approach with compensating controls, still perfectly valid, and customized approach, completely a completely customized implementation of the control that applies exactly and only in your case. I hope that answered your question.
Great. The next one is, can you talk about what automated log review is?
That's a good one. We didn't get to that one, but automated log review is really honestly, in this market, in this day, it's a mature market. It's implement a SIM. It's a security information event management tool that's taking the logs from all the things and parsing them and determining based on the correlation of the events, is something bad happening, right? And so it's a very mature market out there for security information event management. And that's honestly, when I read that statement, when I read that you must now have automated, I read that as you must now have SIM.
All right, the next one, do the ASV scans have to be authenticated as well?
No, that is only for internal vulnerability scans. ASV scans, I have not seen anything in the new version of the standard that says that those now need to be authenticated. It really only even has meaningful context, and this is like, I'm thinking about it as a computer scientist. My training is in computer science, right? Thinking about it as a computer scientist, that requirement can only really have meaning for internal vulnerability scans.
All right, next one, please elaborate on when you say MFA access to the CDE is not applicable on users who have access to one credit card at a time, specifically in the case of call centers or modem.
Yeah, so there are a number of requirements under requirement 8 that apply only, that it's easier to say it this way, that do not apply to individuals who have only access to one credit card number at a time. Now, what that means is they type it in and it's gone forever as far as they're concerned. They can never get it back. So that might apply to a call center agent, but that might not apply to a call center agent manager, who can then listen to recordings where cardholder data might be present. Now they have access to more than one credit card number, right? Or who can perform a search or a query, anybody like that. So it would apply to call center agents who type a credit card number in and it's gone forever, but it might not apply to the entire call center operations.
All right, we are a data center co-location company. Can you elaborate a bit on which of these requirements probably apply to us?
Oh, yeah, you bet. So as a data center co-location operations, right, your customers are counting on you for physical security. That's really the first half of requirement 9, right? That you've got facility entry controls, you've got cameras, you've got badges, and not just anybody can walk in off the street and gain access to systems that are in racks, okay? That's really what we're talking about. Now, you might also offer the white glove treatment and swap out tape media, and maybe those tapes are in your vault. Maybe that's not, Iron Mountain coming to pick them up every day kind of a thing, right? And so there might also be some that come up in the latter half of 9, requirement 9, that apply to you. But let's just say it is, straight up colo ping power pipe, that's it, right? And so requirement 9, there is only one net new requirement in requirement 9, and that has to do with point of sale POI devices. That's the thing you stick your credit card into at the cashier, right? That's not you as a data center operation. But there are a number under requirement 12, and that's the other place that we would look to for data center operations, that you have an information security program that can manage your physical security obligations in a PCI compliant manner, right? So for that, that PCI DSS scoping validation that we already talked about earlier, that applies, because yes, you still have to define your scope because it's the physical security controls, right? And that has to be done every 6 months. There's some things under incident response training. There's the targeted risk assessment that could apply to some of the things that we're talking about in requirement 12. There's the 1292 that we talked about, having the materials to support your customers in their completion of their 12.8 requirements for managing vendors and whatnot. Security awareness training was under there for the anti-phishing and social engineering. We've probably got up to about 8 or 9 different requirements already and most of those, all of those, I think, are under requirement 12. So 8 or 9 net new requirements that apply in that case.
All right, we've got one more we're going to try and squeeze in. If the call recordings have pan masked and cannot be played back, will MFA still be applicable on those listening to the recordings?
If there is absolutely no ability to resurrect that cardholder data, in other words, like it's masked in the stream, right? At the moment of recording, it's actually masked. Then we wouldn't even consider that those call recordings have cardholder data in them, because they never did and they never will. But if it's a case where it gets recorded and then sent off to like a service provider, we've got a couple of customers who do that, right? Who will scrub those and take out all the PII. If that's the kind of operation, then like where are the original MP3 files that got, or OG, whatever the file format is, where are the original ones and who has access to those? So that could still apply. But again, if it's redacted out of the call stream at the point of recording, and by the way, the same kind of consideration around screen scraping, right? If you have screen scrapers that go on in your call center operations, that could also capture the cardholder data as it's being typed in. But as long as it's not being captured at the point of the recording, screen scraping, or audio recordings, then I don't even think we'd consider that has cardholder data.
Okay. I know we're a little bit over time, but we have another question that just came in, so I'm going to get that one to you, Randy. For the controls left up to organizations to determine themselves, such as password expiration, malware scanning, if the requirements are set up in manner compliant with what PCI 3.2.1 says, is still TRA, will that be needed? I hope I got that right.
I think I understand the question. Let me rephrase it, right? So I think the question is, we've already been doing these things on the frequency that was established under 3.2.1, and now 4 gives us the flexibility to do it when we want to, and however frequently we determine is appropriate. Will I still need a TRA if I'm not changing the frequency from what I was doing for 3.2.1? I think that would end up being a. I think the answer would still be yes, only because like they didn't really, the standard kind of just says, determine what your frequency is, and for every single, they don't really give us an if in there, right? There's no conditional clause. If you're doing it the same way as you always have, then don't do it. They didn't give us that option. So I think the answer would still have to be yes, but the analysis I think would be pretty straightforward. We're still going to change our passwords every 90 days, and the reason why is because we don't feel great about doing it every year. Okay, I think we'll flesh that out a little bit more, but I think that reasoning probably holds accurately.
All right, thank you for going through all of those. There were a couple questions about the recording and slides, and as a reminder, those will be sent out tomorrow. If you do have any follow-up questions, please send that to the email on the screen. We'd be happy to be able to respond to those. And Randy shared a bunch of different changes that are happening. We want to make sure that we are helping you with your security and your cloud compliance. On the next slide, Randy, there is a code. If you go to explore.kirkpatrickprice.com, we're offering free scans. So you can use the code LIFTOFF to get a month of unlimited scans on your AWS, Azure, or GCP environment. So please take advantage of that. This will also be in the follow-up slides. We're thankful that you joined us. Again, we would love to partner with you. Contact us if we can help with anything. You guys enjoy the afternoon.